Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Deviant Mind. This is Dominika.
And this is Chris.
And we are doing the Weepy Voiced Killer today, Paul Michael Stephani. And we're going back in time to, he started, he attacked his first victim on New Year's Day, 1980.
81,
So,
I think.
uh,
Or was it 81 they found the body?
I think,
Yeah, it's New Year's. I think it's
yeah.
New Year's Eve he commits it, and then they find the body on New
And then
Year's
they
Day.
find by in 1981, like the first day of 1981. So, and what was interesting is about this case is that two of his attackees actually survived, and he did kill three women that we will go over and talk about. But the first person he attacked actually survived. I guess it was lucky that she was in Minneapolis in the wintertime, because I think that was what saved her life. So I guess we can start. But, actually, before we hopped on this call, it has come out that, Chris, you actually texted me about the drug dealer in the Murder, She Wrote, killer wife who wrote the book about her husband dying, and she's actually on trial for murder. I believe her name is Kari Norins. Is that Newlands? Did I get her name right?
I forget the title of the grief book for children.
Yeah. So that one. So that case is going through the courts, and it just came out that she actually would purchase the fentanyl from her housekeeper, the housekeeper that she was using for her investment properties was in fact the drug dealer, and she had a drug dealer conviction, I guess 3-4 years ago.
Yeah.
And yeah, so, which is kind of crazy. I was like, wow, didn't see that coming. Here I am thinking like it's a full on the kind of drug dealer you always think about, and not like 50 something Corey Richens, that's her name. That was our case from a couple weeks ago. That she is actually, her name is Carmen Marie Lauber, and she's 51, and she sold Corey Richens 15 to 30 fentanyl pills on two separate occasions for about $900 each time. And I guess she had a pretty big enterprise going. And yeah, 50-year-old housekeeper as the drug dealer. Didn't see that one coming.
And especially after she says that she got the drugs from a guy, from some dude that she knew. And he dropped she claimed it was like for her real estate prospective buyers. One of them has like back issues. Do you have anything? Anyways, the whole time she's saying that she's getting it from a guy. And when this comes out, and it's just like, whoa, okay.
Yeah. And this housekeeper actually in 2021 was convicted of drug possession with intent to distribute, a first degree felony. So I guess, and that case got sent to drug court. So yeah, fascinating. It's just interesting to see who is doing the drug dealing and supplying over on that case. It's definitely not your.
She's trying to poison her husband. Maybe that's one of the prerequisites to being their housekeeper.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Good job. Oh, do you have access to poison and drugs? Great.
Great. Yeah, you got the job. You're hired. Yeah. Excellent. Okay. Well, back to our case for this week. Paul Michael Stephani. Do you know if it's Stephani or Stephani? It's probably Stephani.
Stephani.
So his first victim was 20-year-old Karen Potak, who was a University of Stevens Point student. Now, I actually tried looking into her, but I couldn't really find that much about her. I couldn't pretty much find anything. Did you find out any of her kind of before this attack, anything about her life?
I know that she was 20 years old at the time, and he was 36. Okay. She was walking home. This is in St. Paul, Minnesota. And from what I understand, she was a good student. I mean, she was, a college student. And that's about all I found out.
Yeah, I also had a lot of trouble finding out exactly about her. And then also after she survived, like where she went, and she just kind of kept her life out of the newspapers for pretty much after this. But in any case,
Well, she's beaten so bad that her memory is just pretty much gone. She
right.
remembers nothing.
Right. She is still dealing with brain damage. So essentially she was walking home from a nightclub where she was with her friends at approximately 1 a.m. on New Year's Day. So really it's night, but New Year's Eve/day. And she was walking down the street near Pierce Butler Road and Syndicate Avenue, and she was attacked by a man with a tire iron. And she was alive when he left her. And again, it's St. Paul, Minneapolis. So it's, very cold. So
I'm sorry, Minneapolis, not Minnesota. Yeah. I said St. Paul, Minnesota.
Well, yeah. I think St. Paul, Minneapolis, isn't that all in Minnesota? Because Minneapolis isn't a state. Minnesota is a state.
Oh, yes.
Now we're like, now we just show how good we are at geography. Cool.
You are nice. But geography,
exactly. So, as we are, we got the actual 911 calls that Paul Michael Stephani left, and this was the first one that came in at around 3 a.m. and he was doing his weepy voice with emotion, and this is the one that we started this episode with. And he directed the police to the crime scene saying, quote, "There's a girl hurt there." And when they arrived, she was still alive and she was rushed to the hospital. But she was left without memory, and she did have brain damage subsequently that she had to deal with. But
when the cops showed up, her brains are exposed.
Yeah. So, I mean, she survived, but definitely with some brain damage. So he took a bit of a break, and his next attack happened on June 3rd, 1981. And it was an 18-year-old girl named Kimberly Compton. And this time he made sure that she was dead. She was stabbed to death with an ice pick. I believe I read somewhere like over 30 times. And she was also then strangled with a shoelace.
Yes.
And when her body was discovered by a group of teenage boys in the woods near, I guess, Superior and Oneida streets. And I believe they found her naked, which must have been horrifying.
Well, so she's discovered. So he goes 5 months. That's he kills Karen, and then 5 months later, he kills Kimberly Compton.
Well, he tried. It's like attempted murder. Karen survived, but he attacked Karen.
Right, I beg your pardon. And then it's actually boys playing ball who find Compton in bushes. Okay. She has no ID, but a key to a bus station locker. And when they go to the bus station, that's where they find her ID and they're able to identify her. She was actually stabbed 61 times.
With the ice pick.
Correct.
Okay. Which seems pretty, yeah. Yes, they made sure she was dead.
And then again, 2 days later, he makes another call. And this is when they trace the call to a phone booth at a gas station, but they check for fingerprints and they're examining the wrong payphone because there are actually 2 payphones at this location. So that was interesting. And I believe in this second call, he takes credit and mentions his first victim by name, or maybe that comes later when he mentions Compton. But either way, these are taunting calls.
Yeah,
at the same time, it's guilt-ridden every call.
Right. Like, I believe the quote for the second call is, "Goddamn, will you find me? I just stabbed somebody with an ice pick. I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody," as he's crying. And then he calls back and says, "I'll try not to kill anyone else." Which
What's
is
interesting, what's interesting also is that the 911 operator at the time recognized his voice from 5 months earlier.
she's like, "Oh, this guy again." Okay.
Right. And then it's at that time that the police come out and tell the media that there's a serial killer. And then on television, they tell the media this. So then all the media outlets can play the 911 calls to see if anyone out there watching can recognize the voice somehow.
Right. But they don't get any clues as far as that, because as we'll go into later, his voice actually changes when he's under stress, which is actually also the way he gets caught, which is fascinating. So
also, if I may,
yeah.
Another interesting tidbit is his first two victims are both in red. So when the police go to the media, women are warned not to wear red, which we'll come to again later. There's a specific reason why he's choosing red.
Right. Which again, like, I mean, just kind of fascinating to hear, like, oh, okay, women don't wear red versus we got to find this guy. But anyway, just something that stuck out to me. So then he managed to keep it together through July. However, he attacked his third woman on the 5th of August, 19. Oh no, I'm sorry. He managed to wait for a year. And he attacked his next woman in 1982 on the 5th of August. And she was 40-year-old Barbara Simons. And she was also stabbed to death with an ice pick. And her body was discovered along the Mississippi River near the 29th Street and was discovered by a newspaper carrier. But what I find interesting is, well, he called the police again. And this was, I think you mentioned the line, "Please don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry, I killed that girl." Which, by the way, 40-year-old is not a girl, but that's something, something interesting. "I stabbed her 40 times. Kimberly Compton was the first one over in St. Paul."
Yeah.
So he connects himself to Kimberly. And of course, with Kimberly, he connected himself to Karen, which sounds like he's a bit of a media whore too, right? Like,
yes,
connect me. I am doing all of these. And Barbara had been at a local bar, and she had decided to give a guy a lift home, who people described as 40 years old, 6 feet tall, and around 185 pounds. And so the police thought that the person she had said she'd give a ride home to was most likely the person who killed her.
Incidentally, they were dancing at the bar. They actually got along, and he offered her a ride home, to which she leans over and tells the bartender, "I'm getting a ride home. I hope this guy's cool."
So she didn't give him a ride home. He gave her a ride home. I see.
Yeah, he gives her a ride home. And the bartender gave a description of Paul, the Weepy Killer. And the bartender, I believe, also was able to pick out Paul from photos.
That's interesting. Okay.
Which is interesting.
So he was able to actually pick him up out of a lineup.
And then Barbara's purse was found in a mailbox. And that's when they were able to identify her as Barbara Simon, who worked as a nurse in St. Paul. Also, what's interesting is in 1982, or actually, I'm sorry, in 1981, late August, there's an Alan Lopez who says that he's responsible for killing Kimberly Compton. So all these red flags go up. They rush over to his house, SWAT team, full gear, ready to go, because he's holding his family hostage, this Alan Lopez, okay? The one who's confessing to the Kimberly Compton. The standoff ends, SWAT enters, and they find that he's actually killed his family. In 1982, he's in jail and commits suicide. So for a while, that was a huge red herring, because people were like, well, did he? But then they compared his voice to the calls, and they're like, there's something off. We don't know. We don't think it's him. But for a while, this was mystifying everyone. Like, he claims he did this, he murdered his family, and now he commits suicide. So look, that was a really weird thing that threw everyone off.
Right, because they assumed that they had gotten the guy, and then when he committed suicide and there was more murder happening, then they're like, oh, wait a minute, he wasn't the guy?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think actually I skipped over Kathleen Greening, which she was found in her home. She was, let me see.
Yeah. This was his first killing that no one knew about, and actually went cold. This was a cold case.
Because she was found in her home, because she actually wasn't stabbed. She was drowned in her own bathtub. And
in the suburbs.
And this was on July 21st, 1982. So a couple of weeks before Barbara Simons. Simons. So Kathy, as she was known, was
Kathy Greening, by the way.
Yeah, Kathy Greening. She was, again, as we said, found dead at her home, and he actually confessed to drowning her in the bathtub. So, as you said, they assumed that it was just a cold case. And did he ever say how they were connected?
So, yeah, this was, what was interesting was that he didn't know her name, or he claims he didn't know her name. No one really knew about this. It went cold. Her husband was actually a suspect at the time, and she was a school teacher. And what's interesting is perhaps her relationship wasn't going well, but their connection is that she goes on a date with Paul. And he saw and hung out with her a few times, and he really liked her.
Mm-hmm.
And then I don't know why, we don't know why, but he chokes her and drowns her in her own bathtub.
I see. Okay.
And later we find out that this was really one of the murders that he was most ashamed of. And I think it's because he had this interaction, this personal relationship with her, was close. And this is someone he was close with. His other victims, he didn't know, but he knew her.
Right. Well, yeah, exactly. And it's interesting that the victims changed, where both Karen and Kimberly were 18-year-old students, whereas Kathleen and Barbara were in middle-aged, right?
Yeah.
And then he goes back, which is kind of how he ends up getting captured, is he attacks a 19-year-old sex worker.
Yeah.
Named Denise Williams on August 21st, 1982. So it's interesting. It's like he was able to keep it together for a year, and then the victims in 1982 came in very fast, short order, right? Like, so it almost feels like a frenzy, because he killed 2 women and attacked the third within 3 weeks.
And I think that's also because that may be, with the whole Lopez incident, like him being like, no, it wasn't him. Watch this. Yeah, because the killing it occurs in the same month that Lopez is, on trial and goes to jail. So it's in August. So I think when he's like, I did it, and then all of a sudden there's another one, that's to prove something. Also, what's interesting is that in Kathy's contact book, his number was in it. So that's of note.
They really did have they did have a friendship relationship situation going on then.
For sure. And then also what's interesting is that, again, we have a case where he puts her purse in a mailbox. And another thing that was interesting about her death at the time and why it went cold was because they didn't actually know if it was an accident or not. If she slipped and accidentally drowned in the tub or whatever. That's what you're saying. To determine homicide versus accident.
Right. Accidental. So as we mentioned before, this is kind of how his last victim that he attacks, and this is how he ends up getting caught, is 19-year-old Denise Williams. As we mentioned, she was a sex worker from Minneapolis, and she was working the streets when she was approached by this man. And they worked out a price for her services. She hopped into his car, and he drove her to a dead-end road. And she was like, uh-oh, something's going to happen here. This is not good. And before she was able to get out of the car, he lunged at her with a screwdriver and stabbed her a total of 15 times as she was trapped underneath him in the passenger seat. She noticed a glass bottle sitting in the footwell, and she managed to pick it up, smash it across the face of him, and then fled from the car. And she was able to survive this. But he was actually really hurt. And so he went back to his apartment and said, I think I got to get medical attention because I have this massive wound on my face. So he called the St. Paul Fire Department asking for help. And again, he's calling 911, and the department's like, wait a minute, this guy sounds pretty similar to our Weepy Voiced Killer. And so he was identified, of course, because 911 identifies you as 37-year-old Paul Michael Stephani. And he essentially, even though that he had vocal similarities, he didn't have as high pitched voice as the 911 recordings. But when the detectives brought him in for questioning and he got stressed out, his voice went up several octaves, and they were like, oh, this is our guy. And what was interesting is that when he went to trial, he was only found guilty of the murder of Barbara Simons. But because they didn't have enough evidence, they couldn't convict him of the other murders. But in 1997, he confessed to the murder of Kim Compton, as well as to the murders of Barbara Simons and Kathy Greening. And that's when you had mentioned that he had actually, brought her name, and they didn't know that he was connected because he claimed he was motivated to confess because he found out he had cancer, and he ended up dying of that cancer in prison on June 12th, 1998. So if he hadn't confessed, then they would have never really put him together with the murder of Kathleen Greening. That was interesting.
So to back up with regards to Denise Williams, yes. August 21st, 1982, when she takes off, there's actually a bystander, and this fella tries to intervene, and actually Paul goes after him and then runs away.
Oh,
yeah, and then that's when there's a bit of a fight. It's a failed attack, but this guy, it's like she saves herself, and then this guy comes out of nowhere for reinforcement, and that's what basically drives Paul away. We don't know. Paul may have continued to go after her, but luckily this person was there, and she winds up being a hero. She's able to pick him out of photos. And then when you mentioned they recognize his call because he's like, oh, I'm hurt, I need the ambulance. They put a surveillance on him, and they're actually tracking him the whole time. But he slips out, and when they have their opportunity, that's when they just go in and bust him. And he gets he's never tried it, as you said, for the St. Paul crimes.
But he does go down for attacking
second degree and attempted murder.
Yeah.
So that's 58 years in prison that he gets for that. And what's interesting is that during the St. Paul cases, the judge throws the 911 calls out, saying that they're not relevant to the case, and that he believes there's no connection to Karen and Kimberly. That's according to the judge.
Wow.
So, but in 84 and 85, during that trial, he pleads not guilty, but the calls are played. And his sister and ex-wife, yes, he was married. They recognize his voice too, and they help him get locked up. And then, 12 years into his sentence, he finds out he has skin cancer, admits to the St. Paul crimes, and basically he wants credit before he dies.
Yeah.
I think that's ultimately what drives him to his confession. Also, to back up, he comes from, he's born in 1970. And, oh no, I'm sorry, I beg your pardon. His parents, let me back this up. That's when he gets married. And he grows up and his parents get divorced. And he has, oh, I'm sorry. He's born in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in 1944. In a very
it's
small
the
town in
Wisconsin, Minnesota thing that's getting us kind of confused here. So,
parents get divorced, and he has a very strict Catholic stepfather, and he has a very strong bond with his mom. But he's going to church now. He's starting to go to church a lot with his stepdad, and has epilepsy. And due to his epilepsy, it actually over time causes him to lose many jobs that he's trying to hold down.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1970, he gets married, but then 5 years later gets a divorce. And this really angers him because it's against Catholicism, right?
Right. Can't get divorced.
And right. And so that's when he actually he has an assault. He assaults someone shortly after the divorce. Now, it was unclear whether or not it was his ex-wife or if it was some random victim. But after the divorce, he's starting to show, all this anger and everything's manifesting. And then he later dates a Syrian girl for 4 years. And things are looking great. This is like it. He's found love. They're together. But then she has to leave him because she's part of an arranged marriage. So she actually has to leave the United States, and he's crushed. In photos of him with the Syrian woman, she's mostly wearing red dresses.
So that's where the red connection comes in.
Yes, which is pretty interesting.
I see.
And then so she leaves. He loses another job. And basically, this is where he starts going to town. I mean, and then what's interesting also is the last job he had was at a factory, which his first victim who survived
was found right next to 3 years after his firing. So it was the Malberg Manufacturing Company, and he was fired from his job in 1977. And his first victim was found right near there, like 3 years after that.
And he mentions it. He mentions the factory by name in that call. And that was another thing that led authorities to connect the dots. Oh, he's calling from this location. Oh, he worked there. So, I mean, there were signs, but it was just very difficult because the calls take everyone for a loop. He is Catholic, so maybe he has a way of turning it on and turning it off, but no signs, there was no abuse towards animals. This isn't your typical, psychopathic, sociopath background that he has.
Well, I mean, supposedly the stepfather had a proclivity for beating the shit out of his stepchildren. He actually was the second of 10 kids.
Oh, see, I didn't find that out.
Yeah, at least, per something I found. And so, again, and he's growing up, he was born in 1944. So, again, my idea of like, the screwed up fathers that were like beating the crap out of their boys in the 50s to then create these monsters that went to kill when they were men.
Yeah. I just assumed he was from what I found, he was just like a very strict, his stepfather, very strict Bible thumper. I didn't realize.
It was interesting though, if he's very strict, and again, we have to think about how different child rearing is right now compared to back then. I was actually reading a book that originally came out in 1980 about how to talk with your children. And they kept talking about smacking their kids in the face once the parent got too angry. And I was like, wait a minute, when was this? And this is completely separate from this case, but it was just like, wait a minute, when was this published again? And I was like, oh, it was 1980. And I think we forget how much corporal punishment was normalized and used by families to keep their kids in line. And so that's normal families. So if we have a very strict Catholic stepfather all of a sudden trying to keep 10 kids in line, I mean, you got to think that there's some massive abuse going on there of the physical kind, because again, I went to Catholic school and I got my hands hit by the nuns. Like, it was just a normal part of life back then. And so when we're talking about the 60s and the 70s, I mean, yeah, some dads punched their sons in the face. We just don't think about that because it's in the you'd get arrested now. Back then, that was pretty normal. I mean, obviously looked down upon, because if your kid came back with a black eye and it was from his dad, like, that'd be like, oh no. But that was so much more normalized, like violence against your children versus what we're doing now.
Also, in the last case, one of the last cases we discussed is Susan Smith. That whole corporal punishment and not comes up again. And there are a bunch of parental counselors, psychiatrists who believe that it's actually very detrimental and terrible to spank your children. So there's now that, around the Susan Smith time, you have the old generation thinking, no, this is how you punish your kids, versus this new thought, which we developed into what we have, I believe, now. So it's interesting, it's just like, it takes horrible tragedies, I guess, in order for things to change. Well, some things to change.
Right. So, I mean, again, it was just like a line in passing about how there was talk of corporal punishment with the stepfather, but again, kind of extrapolating what those times were like and knowing, very Catholic, very strict people. Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised.
And this is probably why he does create such a close bond with his mom. They were very close and really had a strong bond. Maybe it was just like, stepdad's terrible, but this is my mom. She's always been here. She's here for me, or something.
Which is fascinating, because usually men who kill women tend to have issues with their mother.
Right.
And I wonder if there was some way he was trying to get the rage out on women, especially when he starts killing the women in the 40s. Which is probably what his mom would have been like when he was a kid. And again, I'm totally like armchair psychologist thing right now. But, there is a thing of like, why didn't you protect me against this person who is not my dad? Like, why did you allow him to do that? And there can be a lot of misplaced rage towards the mother, which, quite frankly, why didn't you protect him? And we don't know if the mother actually took the stepfather's side. Like, we don't know exactly what happened, but like, why women? And like, stabbing 30, 40 times, like, that is such frenzied overkill that
it's also, I think it stems from like this whole idea of desertion, right? He has his mom who's maybe deserting him in that way. And he needs her attention, needs her protection, maybe doesn't get it. Has a marriage, it's unsuccessful, feels perhaps abandoned, and things didn't work out, and that's where the anger really starts. Syrian woman deserts him. So I think maybe it's just like this built-up anger, and then it's just like, oh my God, look at the women in my life. They all leave me or they ignore me. And maybe that could be his drive for doing this to innocent women,
Yeah.
Also, what's interesting about I just want to throw this in there with the Barbara Simon case, was with the screwdriver. So he's kind of all over the place: an ice pick, a tire iron, a screwdriver. There's no rhyme or reason to what he's going to use. Shoelaces. I mean, it's drowning. The shoelace and the drowning are definitely a little separate, but the
I mean, typically stabbing the victims has always, by profilers, had said that that was a replacement for sex, right?
Yeah.
Fornication.
It's very
So
interesting.
it is very intimate. It's very sexual. Typically, the person who's stabbing tends to hurt themselves because the hand slips on the blade. It's like a very visceral thing of making holes in another body. And so maybe you're right about the Syrian woman with the red dress, but it was definitely um, those type of crimes. Like, was he able to function sexually? Obviously, he fathered a child, but yeah, it's disturbing. And actually, I pulled up a quote from the detectives. It was a detective, Don Brown, from the Minneapolis PD, said that when, this is a quote, when I went over and opened up the file case, when they were trying to get the confession out of him, I had, and this is back to the quote, I had photographs of the victims. He looked up and his eyelids started fluttering, and I could almost see that he was envisioning these homicides over in his mind.
Yeah.
And then, quote, his voice immediately changed. It went to a high pitch. Right away, it struck me as the voice in the recordings. And in all my past experiences up to that point, I have never seen any person change personalities in front of me. End quote. I knew I had him at that
That's
point,
right.
detective said.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we don't know. Obviously, there's whatever brought him to kill these women. He's still a piece of shit. Like, there's no, I don't want to blame anybody in his life for making him what he was, but there are, again, like, what was the trigger? Was it the firing? As you said, was it divorce, being left behind, then being left behind by his girlfriend? Precipitate.
Mhm.
And there was another quote that I found from him being like, I always thought that killing was just normal, like driving a car.
Mhm.
So I'm like, okay, well, if that was the case, then why did you start killing at 37? And did you kill before?
Right. Uh,
Like
I also
animal,
just want, I
like
just want
maybe
to
we
also,
don't know. Go ahead.
right. I just want to throw out there with regards to how we focus on victims. Kimberly Compton, actually, the whole bus station locker, and this was actually her first day in St. Paul, and she
Um,
went there to start a new life. So that was literally her first day in St. Paul to start a new life, and when that happened to her, I just want to throw that out there.
yeah.
This also could be Catholic guilt. And the idea of his family when he was growing up falling apart, the fact that he couldn't have his own family, and the stepfather, regardless of any sort of abuse that may have come from him, did sort of get Paul into church, got him to become Catholic.
Right.
So maybe the 911 calls are his Catholic guilt coming out, like it's confession in a way, and if killing is like driving a car to him, that leads me to believe, you have a bit of psychopathy having there. He's psychopathic, and the calls, the weepy, is probably he may have heard someone else weep before, because a lot of psychotics don't know emotions. They don't know how to describe emotions, and a lot of the ways they interact with us, they reach back from memory,
Mm-hmm.
recall how other people have reacted. So they themselves may be incapable of looking sad or sounding sad, but they have a recall. Oh, I remember what it's like because,
Right.
my mom cried, my brother cried. So they'll emulate that. And so that could also be why he's doing the weeping, is because he feels lousy about it and he knows that that's how you do it. Because, why wouldn't you call and just be, why call? That's the
Why
first
call?
thing.
Yeah.
Why
Why
call?
call? Like, what
I
is
mean,
the,
he could
well,
have kept
except for,
killing.
well, but also, again, for being omnipotent, not omnipotent, but the other one where he's a complete failure in everything, right? He
Mhm.
gets fired from his job. He has he's pretty much only worked as a janitor, like had very low menial jobs, and he got fired from those. And so now he's doing something that I'm sure is making the entire city kind of freak out, right? He's the serial killer. And it's again this idea of wanting the fame and,
Yeah.
being supposedly, quote unquote, smart enough to play cat and mouse with
Mhm.
the detectives. Anyway,
Yeah.
it's very pathetic. And
It's really strange and pathetic. And also, and again, those jobs lost and everything else, maybe this plays a factor, but it's epilepsy. I mean, maybe it was just like, oh God, like beaten by my stepdad, forced into Catholicism, losing all these relationships. It just all kind of snowballs. And yet another case where you have someone that obviously needed mental help, but how do you get that mental help if you don't want it, or you're ignoring it, or you feel justified? Obviously these women, the first victim is wearing red, must have triggered him in some way. And he's unable to control himself, you know. But this is definitely a strange case. And I think it's, you have, this is on the heels, I guess this is a few 5 or 6 years removed from the Son of Sam, where you have the Son of Sam, you have Berkowitz kind of taunting, with those letters. But the more I think about it, maybe it's more of this confession than it is taunting.
Yeah, confession. Yeah, just like the Catholic guilt hitting really hard. In any case, all in all, a very pathetic man. And the two women who survived were, I mean, oh my God, I can't even imagine. And lives lost because another dude was a complete loser. Anyway, so that is the case of the Weepy Voiced Killer. And we will put in the actual 911 calls in. And let us know what you think. And thanks for joining us on this summer edition of the Deviant Mind, which is why we're kind of a little bit all over the place as far as our weekly date and time that we come out. But thank you so much for sticking with us. And tell
your friends to give a listen and check out our YouTube channel and subscribe there.
Exactly. All right, till next week. Thank you guys. This episode was sponsored by The Creek Killer, Book 1 in the Harriet Harper thriller series written by me, Dominika Best. What would you do if you read the police found your body in a creek? Find out in The Creek Killer, available on Amazon. Thank you for joining me and listening to this episode. If you like my show, please give me a rating and review. It helps other listeners find this podcast. Follow Dominika Best Presents The Deviant Mind wherever you listen to your podcasts. Visit thebeststorytellingnetwork.com, where you'll find show notes, my books, links to social media, and much more. Join my Patreon for special subscriber perks, like 2 extra exclusive episodes a month and a Q&A with me at patreon.com/The Deviant Mind Podcast. Until next time.